Hello and welcome to today's webcast, the VMware Backup with Symantec NetBackup 7.6 Key Capacity and Practice, brought to you by DataLink. I'm Chandani McDermott. I'm part of the marketing team here at DataLink and will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping items. This webcast is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. The webcast console you're looking at can be completely customized. You can resize, move, or any of the windows that you have open. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. We will try to answer these questions during the webcast, but if further answer is needed, we will run out of time. They'll be answered via email or other medium. All questions from this webcast will be captured. If you are experiencing any difficulties, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the help button below the presentation window. It is the question mark icon and cover common technical issues. Our presenter today is Senior System Engineer Chette Boardman. He is joined by Advanced Technical Support Engineer Hep Nguyen and Brad Brusky, who will be assisting Chette in answering your questions throughout the presentation. I would like to now turn over this presentation to our presenter, Chette Boardman. Please take over.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to cover NetBackup and VMware and how to properly protect your virtual machines and we're going to cover some of the advanced features that are included in the 7.6 and 7.6.1 releases, including Accelerator. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So we'll start off by jumping right in, how it all works. With NetBackup latest releases, they included the vCenter API. This API is written by VMware. It's put out there for developers to allow interface with virtual machines through automated application program interfaces, what it's referred to as. The API handles all the operations, and it's the interface between NetBackup and VMware in this case. In most cases, NetBackup client doesn't even need to be installed on the virtual machine, so that's one big advantage. With traditional backups, you had to install the client within each machine, set up a policy, whether it was an MS Windows or a standard policy, to cover backing up that machine. With VMware and the API interface, you can now remove that requirement for having the client installed on each machine for the majority of backups. There is one exception to this, and that is the application backup, and I'll get into that in a little bit in some of the slides here. We'll cover that. But for specific instances, you will need the client and the Symantec VSS providers to be installed on the VM to protect the applications within that VM. There's some considerations for backing up your virtual machines to give yourself the best throughput, as well as to properly protect your machines. You need to be aware of some considerations. One of the key considerations is that you must be able to snap your virtual machines within vCenter to be able to back them up with NetBackup. Snaps can take considerable I/O both on creation and removal, because we essentially are pausing the virtual machine for a very minor amount of time while we create that snapshot. It's the equivalent of going into VMware, right-clicking on a virtual machine and taking a snapshot. There is a brief pause in the machine, typically not noticed by your users, but it is something that does happen. And while this is happening, there is additional I/O that's required for that. And for a smaller VMware environment where you have high I/O, this could interrupt and cause issues. So that's something you'll want to look at, what your typical I/O is. The typical large I/O operations are during the removal of the snapshot, where we have to consolidate those changes back into the original VMDK file. So that is the larger amount of I/O. The taking of the snapshot is not as large. One of the considerations is snapping a database server is not considered reliable. If you have a SQL server running and you attempt to snap the virtual machine and you're going to use that as your sole method of recovering SQL, it will cause problems, and typically when you attempt to restore the VM, the virtual machine itself will be fine, but the databases within SQL will be in a recovery state or in some cases not recoverable. So that's why you have to take that into consideration, and you still need to use several different methods, which I will cover in a little bit here, on protecting those. This is a limitation of VMware and not NetBackup, and I want to kind of highlight that because you're snapping a virtual machine. VMware is not necessarily aware that SQL or Exchange or Oracle or any of those database type applications are on the virtual machine. It's just taking a snapshot like you tell it to. And as I said earlier, a restore will complete successfully, but the database may not be consistent. And Symantec will not support this and will not assist with a recovery under these conditions. Another item I'd like to point out that I have seen this. A lot of customers are moving to virtual machines, virtual environments, because you're leveraging your resources better. You have a server out there with multiple processors, multiple cores, large amounts of RAM. So VMware is very common, and almost all corporations that I've run into do leverage it. And with that, the reliance on hardware becomes less and less, so data centers are downsizing. And one of the things that I'm seeing a lot more of is that the customers are virtualizing their master server. It's important to note that if you do virtualize your master server, that you should exclude it from any virtual machine backups of it. In other words, you don't want to be trying to snap your master server with the database and NetBackup running. It will lead to errors. Common errors such as 2505 and 636 are what I commonly see. 636 is the big one. In actuality, it's not a good practice to snap any of the NetBackup servers such as media servers. Now, this doesn't apply to clients, but a master server, a media server, if you separate out your EMM to its own server, you should not snap that. Any of the NetBackup server functions, you should not snap those. And restoring a media server backup from that snapshot is going to lead to problems with databases on the local machine, inconsistencies in some of the temporary files and things like that. So it's typically not a good idea to do those. One of the other things to consider too is load balancing across your VMware data stores. This is critical to preventing your virtual machines from becoming not responding to customer accesses. For example, if you have a file server that is on the same data store as your Exchange server and maybe your SQL server, attempting to back up all three of those at one time could lead to resource contention, I/O limits, where your users may experience delays or even not be able to access their email or SQL databases or things like that. So you'll want to evaluate your environment to determine what's going to be the best method to back up your virtual machines. Ideally, you would want to back up, say, your file server at one time, and then follow that with your Exchange, and then follow it with your SQL or whatever. But you want to avoid snapping those resource-intensive virtual machines at the same time, so spreading it out. And that requires some evaluation of your environment when you're doing this. So now we'll move on to configuring NetBackup, and the configuration within NetBackup is very basic. They made this very simple and easy to configure and set up so that there's not a lot of overhead with this. So we'll start off with the real basic initial configuration that you'll perform one time in your NetBackup. And so you're going to tell NetBackup about your vCenter or individual ESXI hosts if you're not using a virtual vCenter server to manage those. So in the NetBackup admin console, you'll go down to your credentials and expand out virtual machine servers. You'll right-click and choose New, and you'll enter the vCenter or ESX host name and choose whether or not it's a virtual center server or ESX server. And you can also specify an optional resource ESX server, which I'll get into in a little bit. So you'll then go ahead and click OK and enter the credentials that are used to access this. And you'll want to make sure that the account you use has full administrative rights. There's a lot of snapshot processing and consolidation of virtual machines, so you want to make sure that the account you use has permissions to do that. And the other consideration is when you're restoring your virtual machine, it's very similar to creating a virtual machine, so you want to make sure that your account you're using will have permissions to create the virtual machine as well as to snapshot it, to restore data to it, to write to the data stores. So after you've entered your credentials, you're going to go to host properties of your master server and bring up its properties. You'll select the VMware Access hosts, and you'll add in any servers that are going to be used to handle the backups. Now, this is typically what you're going to do is specify the media servers that you are going to use to back up those virtual machines. It's more important when you are backing up to either a data domain that might be tied to one media server but not another, or SDP on one media server that doesn't get accessed by another. So you want to specify those media servers that are going to be handling the backups. And as you can see here, you must be running either Windows, Red Hat, or SUSE Linux. Those are the supported backup hosts at this time. So now let's move into the backup process. And this is going to entail the backup flow, what's going to happen during the backup, and the steps you can see happen while we're doing this backup. So the backup process flow. NetBackup's going to start the job. It's going to create a parent job, and then a sub-job for each VM will be started to take the snapshot. Once the snapshot job is completed, it will spawn another sub-job for the actual backup of the data, the movement of the data. The job steps at a high level are identify the virtual machines if you're using the VMware Intelligent Policy, VIP, or to manually specify. So you're going to identify those virtual machines. You're going to reach out to VMware through the API to lock the virtual machine to prevent it from migrating to another host. And this can happen if you have throttle set up for I/O, processor, or memory utilization. We wouldn't want that machine to be migrating to another host during backup. And we also wouldn't want to try to move out of a data store if the data store utilization were too high. So we reach out and we place a lock on the VM to prevent the migration. We'll then create a snapshot. We'll determine the data movement type, and I'll cover those here in an upcoming slide. Back up the virtual machines, remove the snapshots, and remove the VM lock, allowing migration to happen. So we'll dig into the snapshotting a little bit here and cover what's going to happen when we're processing a snapshot. And this will allow you to determine what is going to be your resource limits, what's required of a snapshot, and this kind of gives you an idea of what's happening. So NetBackup requests a snapshot by reaching out to vCenter through the API, and you can actually pull up your vSphere console and you'll see the Create Virtual Machine snapshot, and it'll show you the target and the status of it. And as you can see in the screenshot, you can actually see it during the in-progress stage of creating a virtual machine snapshot. And the credentials will show up as the credentials you've specified to create that snapshot. This is identical to right-clicking on a virtual machine in your vSphere console and taking a snapshot. While the snapshot is active, in other words, while the backup is being done, you can look at the virtual machine, right-click, go to Snapshot, and bring up your Snapshot Manager, and you'll see the snapshot. And the snapshot has a very specific format, and it is going to be NBU_snapshot followed by some very specific information, including a C time. And the C time is going to give it that unique snapshot value, so we're sure that we're not going to tell it to take a snapshot and give it the same name as, say, an existing snapshot, so that prevents any duplication or any issues like that. So it essentially reaches out, taps it on the shoulder and says, hey, let's go ahead and take a snapshot of this machine and give it this name. Once the snapshot's complete, vCenter tells NetBackup about the snapshot back through the API. So it says, I've created this snapshot, here's the name of the snapshot, here's all the information about the virtual machine. When you right-click and view a snapshot during a backup, you'll see that the format is NBU_snapshot, the host name, and then there's a C time here. That's that unique value. And you can look at the information about it. And once NetBackup completes its backup of the virtual machine and removes a snapshot, that will disappear out of there. And you'll see the task, remove snapshot, and its status. There are some advanced snapshot options that you can configure in your policy. And there are certain times where you may want to tune these, but by default, they're very stable, and there are only certain conditions where you'd want to alter these values. One of them is the virtual machine quiesce. By default, this is enabled, and this basically is one additional step in the snapshot where we're telling VMware, I want you to take a snapshot, but before you do, I want to flush all the buffers out, make sure everything is kind of quiet on the disk. We're essentially pausing the disk, so we want to make sure that all the disk writes that are going to happen, and we're going to pause those while we take the snapshot so that we don't have data being written while the snapshot's happening. That'll create an inconsistent state. We're going to use virtual disk selection, include all disks. This is a default again. And this is just going to include all virtual disks associated with the VM. Ignore diskless machines. We do not do that by default, and we are going to allow it to post all events to vCenter, and this is going to allow you to sort of see what's going on, and you can even look at historically when snapshots are happening, when backups are happening. So these are the defaults. Typically, you won't need to alter them. Under rare circumstances, you may need to, and usually at that point, you'll want to engage your support staff to determine should you be quiescing a machine, because again, you create an inconsistent state when you do that. Let's cover briefly here the transport methods, the different ways we can move data from VMware to your backup storage. The most common used one lately has been SAN. This is something that is making, this is the most popular method at this point, with most storage being fiber-based and faster SAN speeds. A lot of customers are utilizing SAN. And this basically will use a backup host with a fiber card that has access to the data stores. So you have to make sure that your switch is zoned to have admin access to the data stores. And this will leverage the SAN to move the data from your data store to your storage, whether it's disk or tape. You have a hot add method. This is an older method, and very few customers are actually leveraging this because of the overhead that's required. You're basically going to snap the disks, the virtual disks, and then you're going to attach them to another host to move data. So a lot of overhead while you snap the virtual disk, and then you add that virtual disk to an existing virtual machine to back up the data. And this requires that you have at least one virtual machine hot add host per data store to allow it to attach those disks to it. Another common method, this probably the second most popular, would be NBD. So this is the network movement of data, and it's going to use your network to do this, and you can tailor it to use specific interfaces. This is commonly used if you don't have a fiber card in the backup host that you're moving the data through. It's a great test for identifying SAN issues. If you attempt to back up the virtual machine using the SAN method and it's not working, a good test is to move that over to NBD. Does it start moving data? Okay, so then we need to focus on SAN and zoning and other issues that can show up from that. In the earlier releases of NetBackup 7.5, there were issues with restoring virtual machines through the SAN. The restore would complete with a status 0, and data appears in the data store, but the VM will not boot and displays the error OS not found. And this was a common issue in the early releases. It has been resolved in the 7.6.01 release and going forward. But if you do encounter it, the typical workaround would be to switch your restore transport to network in order to get that machine back, and then look into it further. Under some conditions, customers would prefer to use secure socket layer to back up their data. This is basically NBD with secure sockets. If you require encrypted data transport, you would want to use this method. It is going to be slower than NBD due to having to encrypt the data for transport. This setting is on a per policy basis, so you may have policies that back up across the fiber and some that use either NBD or NBD SSL, so you can customize that per policy. So let's look at some of the policy configuration that you're going to do and the different options that are available to you there. In 7.5 and higher, there's a VMware policy type. Previous to 7.5, this was done as a flash backup, and there was not the nice smooth integration. So now we have a VMware policy type, and we have two types of client selection methods. We can manually browse and select the virtual machines to be backed up, or we can use the VMware Intelligent Policy. Manually specifying your machines has certain benefits to it. It allows you to control what virtual machines are being backed up in what policy, and they are very static so that you can limit it, and you can right-click on a policy and choose an individual VM to back up. That's the one big benefit to manually, is that you can choose to perform an ad hoc backup of a particular virtual machine from a manual policy. For VMware Intelligent Policies, commonly called VIP, you dynamically add newly created VMs based on your query. This is really nice for VMware environments that experience a lot of VMware creations and deletions. The query is executed before the backup happens to identify virtual machines to be backed up. This method is the ideal way to protect your environment, because you're going to be able to leverage or back up newly created VMs without having to go into a policy, manually add that. And sometimes the communication may take a little bit of time when a virtual machine gets created. The admin has to notify that backup administrator if there's different departments, or if it's handled by different people. That communication has to happen to add the virtual machine in. With VMware Intelligent Policy, you don't need to do that. You can specify your query, and you can even test your query, and that's one of the things we'll cover here shortly. The other feature that VIP gives you over manual is it allows you to use VMware throttling of jobs per data stored, number of simultaneous snapshots, and jobs per host. You can set these for non-VIP policies, but they are ignored when you manually select your clients. These throttles are ignored. So first, let's cover the configuration of a VIP policy. So on your Clients tab, you're going to select automatically through query. Use the basic query tool and select your query. This is one method, and it's pretty straightforward. It gives you a nice little kind of like a wizard to go through to configure what your query is going to be to identify your virtual machines. One of the notes that I will say is that if you use advanced mode and you decide to switch back to basic mode, you should clear your query first. This can produce kind of strange results because the window changes, but the query is retained, and some of the advanced features are not part of the basic query method, and it can throw everything off. And one of the things I would highly recommend is to use the test query button after you create or modify any of your queries, and it pops up a nice little dialog where it's going to query your vCenter and show you what's going to be included and what's going to be excluded, so that you can make sure that you're getting what you want to get. Let's talk a little bit about application level backups. And I talked about this earlier about backing up specific items such as Exchange, SQL, and SharePoint. Since these all have databases that are going to be on the virtual machine, you need to have a little extra configuration to be able to identify those resources and back them up. With 7.5, support was added for these application level backups, and it applies specifically to SQL, SharePoint, and Exchange. What this is doing is, instead of backing up the virtual machine and then creating a separate policy for SQL or SharePoint or Exchange, it allows you to more or less combine the two. So when you back up a SQL VM, you back up the whole virtual machine, and then you back up the databases within SQL, and we leverage the Symantec VSS writers to interface with VSS on the virtual machine. And this is why you'll need that client and those Symantec VSS providers. But that data is streamed over and put into the catalog, which allows you to do either database level recovery or the entire virtual machine from one backup stream of data. So it significantly reduces your backup window and gives you extra flexibility in recovery. You can restore individual items that would normally require the agent level backups. And again, you're going to need to install the NetBackup client and the VSS providers created by Symantec for this to be able to leverage this. And you'll simply check the box. And that's the only difference between a non-application level and an application level backup. So some considerations. And we'll just cover some of the common questions that may come up. Why should you use VIP policies? As I had indicated before, we can identify newly created VMs automatically, back them up, and that way you don't end up having a development machine that might have been skipped from backups because it wasn't relayed that that machine had been created. And you can control the load on each ESX host, data store, and vCenter. In some cases, you may have multiple vCenters, and this allows you to leverage those throttles. And the manual selections, this is where you can specify an individual machine or maybe a group of machines that you might want to do ad hoc backups on. What should I choose for a backup host? So there's two methods. You have your backup media server, and this is the ideal situation where you'll want to be able to leverage a media server that has MSDP or data domain or even tape library to be your data mover. And this minimizes the data travel path, which will increase your speeds. You can also identify a specific host if you wanted to create a specific host that is going to handle the data movement for you and relay it to a media server. That option is also available to you. And typically it's going to be a little bit slower process because we're relaying data through. So your backup host is going to manage the snapshot and data movement. So that's a consideration. There's going to be additional load while that is happening. The host has to be either Windows, Red Hat Linux, or SUSE Linux with the NetBackup client at least installed on there. For SAN-based transport, you have to have a fiber card as well. So one of the questions you may be asking is, why would you select vCenter instead of ESX in having individual ESX hosts backed up? That gives you a little more control. Well, with vCenter, it helps you to, or it manages the resources of your ESX environment. All your vCenter is doing is managing all those ESX hosts from one central location, but it manages those resources as well. And so by managing everything through vCenter, vCenter can intelligently handle the snapshots, place the lock on the virtual machine, and it also will allow you to back up virtual machines that maybe have been migrated since the last backup. Since we're not saying backup VM1 off of ESX1, vCenter knows, well, that VM was moved to ESX2, and so you won't have unpredictable behavior or even failures when a VM moves. And it also provides failover of VMs during ESX issues. With a single host, you would put your VM back to, say, a specific host. With vCenter, if that host is not active, if it's in maintenance mode, you can just redirect it to a different host, but vCenter will handle that for you. Some of the new features, let's get into some of those. Those are what everybody loves to look into, the new features. What can we do faster? What enhancements are involved in the latest releases? So this one covers Accelerator with your VM backups. So why do you want to leverage Accelerator? Well, as its name implies, it's going to provide you with faster backups, reducing your backup window. So the volume of data being backed up from VMware environments is typically large, especially with file servers. Those VMDKs get very large. Moving the entire thing every single time for a full backup tends to use a large window. So with Accelerator, you can leverage changed blocks, and I'll get into that in a little bit here. Your traditional full is going to be a lot slower because we're accessing all the data blocks. Every single block that makes up your VM has to be processed. It also requires higher network bandwidth for a longer amount of time. It also increases the I/O and CPU overhead of the virtual machine. Accelerator, what that's going to do is it's going to identify the blocks that have not changed since the backup, and it doesn't need to move those across the network. We already have those backed up across the fiber. We already have those stored. Why are we going to move them again? So we identify those blocks on the VMware side and just moved our changed blocks over. Some of the requirements for this. You have to be at minimum version of 7.6 on the master media server and the client for proxy host system, such as your backup host. If you're using a backup host, it needs to be at 7.6 minimum as well. It needs to be SUSE Linux or Red Hat Enterprise Linux or Windows. The NetBackup 5230 appliance also supports being a backup host. VMware needs to be at least 4.0.3, and you have to have the NetBackup Data Protection Optimization license installed. MS Exchange, SQL, and SharePoint instances must be virtual machine residing on VMDK files, and this is important to note because there is the option to use raw disk mappings. You should, for the Exchange, SQL, and SharePoint, you can't use the raw disk mappings. You have to use a VMDK file. And as before, a NetBackup client has to be installed on those virtual machines for the application level. RDM is also not supported, raw disk mappings. And you also have to have the optimized image attribute for your backup storage. Now this is going to refer to data domain or MSDP. Your storage must support optimized image attribute, and this does not work to tape due to the nature of tape where we're storing data in blocks on removable media. We cannot use Accelerator to tape. So let's move on to what we all want to know about. What are the benefits? I talked about them briefly here, but we're using that VMware Changed Block Tracking and send only the changed blocks of data for backup. So we're sending significantly less data over to your storage. So this results in reduced data store size. So our MSDP or data domain, we're not using as much storage. We're not moving as much data across your network or SAN, so this is all good. And then we synthesize a full virtual machine backup using previous backups plus any changed blocks. So we're not having to snap that virtual machine again and move the data to create a new full. We can actually synthesize it. For this process to happen, the first backup has to be a full traditional backup, and so this does take a bit of time to run, but once that's run, we base everything off of that, and those sub-backups are significantly faster. We reduce the I/O and CPU load within the virtual machine as well as on ESX because we're not having to move the full amount of data, so that's a good thing as well. And again, we're not using as much network bandwidth. It does support granular recovery for Exchange, SQL, and SharePoint, which is another big benefit. So you'll be able to restore those individual items from this same backup that's done with Accelerator. So how does this all work? So we're going to use virtual machines running on the ESX host to track disk sectors that have changed. We're using the change block tracking that's part of VMware. We store the information about the changed blocks in a CTK file under each virtual machine's folder, and they're associated with the VMDK and snapshot file. We have to make sure that CBT is enabled on each VM that is being backed up using Accelerator. So when Accelerator performs a backup, it requests transmission of only those changed blocks. So that's what we were talking about earlier, where we're only moving the data that has changed. Why should we move the whole thing? We'll combine those later in the storage to create our new fulls or our incrementals as needed. We'll combine those blocks that have changed with the blocks that have not changed that we stored earlier to create that incremental. So we'll then transfer the data to the dedupe storage and generate an optimized synthetic full backup if that's the backup that we specify. And then we're going to update the state file on the media server and transfer it to the master server. It basically is going to generate catalog only information for the changes and store that in your NetBackup catalog. The Accelerator full backups will use the same amount of space, but the actual storage of the data is significantly less since we're only moving those change blocks. There are some limitations to be aware of when we're using Accelerator. We only support full backups of SharePoint, Exchange, and SQL, but since we're using Accelerator, we're only grabbing those changed blocks, so the impact of this limitation is negligible. You will need to have an occasional Accelerator forced rescan option schedule. When you're creating your policy, you'll need to have at least one schedule with the forced rescan option turned on, and this is kind of a way of verifying that you have a proper full backup that you can base the changed blocks to synthesize your full backup from. So this is kind of one of the options you'll need to make sure you have at least one of those. The recommendation is at least once every 3 to 6 months, and this is creating a new baseline to base your synthetics off of. The forced rescan runs a non-accelerated backup. So this is going to take as long as a traditional full. It does require additional time, but it does guarantee that you have a proper baseline that's updated. This should not be enabled on every schedule. This is something that you would do every 3 to 6 months, so you wouldn't want to do it on a weekly basis. The other limitation is the target storage unit must support optimized synthetics. The currently supported devices are Data Domain, Pure Disk, and MSDP. As technology advances, other vendors may be added to that list, but at this time we're dealing with Data Domain, Pure Disk, and MSDP. So let's look at some of the restore options now that we're going to use Accelerator and we can do these VM backups and we can do the application level. Let's see what our restore options look like. So at a high level, we can restore the entire virtual machine. So we're putting back everything as it was. For file servers and for static servers, that's usually the option you'll want to choose. Put back the whole thing. We can put it back thin provisioned, so the disk size is not changed. The entire disk size is not allocated once we create that virtual machine. We're going to use thin provisioning typically to only use the space that is required for the data and allow it to grow to the size that you've specified. This can lead to overcommitting in the data store. So this is something you want to be aware of. If you have a older VM that, let's say, has been allocated as a thick provision disk, so in other words, you may have, let's say, 3 volumes that are 1 terabyte apiece and they're thick provisioned, your VMDK allocation is going to be 3 terabytes and all that space is used. If you restore that virtual machine and choose to thin provision it, if you only have 100 gigs on each one, the net usage is going to be 300 gig. Where that can lead to problems if you have multiple machines and you switch to a thin provisioning, you can do a data store overcommit. Your data store might be 8 terabyte, but the actual provision size might be 10 terabyte, and your virtual machines may end up filling up the data store, and this will cause some issues for you. You also can restore a single file from a virtual machine. So if you have a document that was removed off your file server, you need to put that back, but you only did a full backup of the virtual machine, that's not a problem. You can put that single file back, and you're on your way. And that acts just like a traditional restore of a file from a traditional MS Windows or a standard policy type. So let's cover real quick the restore wizard, what it looks like. They have a nice little wizard to put this back, so it's pretty straightforward. So for an original location restore, you're going to choose the destination that you're going to put this back. So you're going to choose the original, and then you're going to choose your transport method, and you'll go ahead and click next. So you'll choose your options and run the pre-recovery check. So you have several different options of restoring the BIOS UUID, which is the unique identifier. If the machine exists and you wish to override it, you can check that box. Otherwise, the job will see that the machine exists in the location and will not restore. You can choose to remove backing information such as a DVD ROM drive, a virtual device. You can choose to remove that. You can choose to remove network interfaces. In some instances, this is a really handy feature if you want to put back your virtual machine, but you don't want it jumping on the network until you've had a chance to check it out, or if you're just looking to pull certain files off of that virtual machine, you might restore it without network capability and just access it through the VMware console. You can choose to power on the virtual machine after recovery. You can set a higher job priority, and you can choose to retain the original hardware version. You can also alter the provisioning, and this is where we covered thin provision. So you can have a thick provision VM restore as a thin provision, and the option is there. Once you've selected all these options and click next, you'll want to click the button for the run pre-recovery check. So this is going to make sure that the data store is available, the location you're putting it to is available, and that there's enough space on the data store for this restore to happen without filling up the data store. A redirected restore is a little bit different. There's a couple of additional options, but it's generally the same nice simple wizard. So we're going to choose an alternate location. We're going to choose the recovery host, the transport method, the vCenter server to put it back to, the individual ESXi server, data store, and folder, so we have the option to put it in a different folder. We also can choose to rename the virtual machine, which is nice for restoring a virtual machine that maybe you just want to pull some of the data off of, and instead of doing a file level, you want to put the whole VM back, and there's certain stuff you want, or you want to look at a specific setting within the virtual machine. So you'll specify these options here. Go ahead and click on Next. For the redirect to restore, we have the same options for your virtual machine, which is your restoring of the BIOS UUID and all of that. One additional option you'll have is your destination for restore. You can choose to put your virtual machine disks back to a different location, different data store, and you'll see that it'll tell you the data store status. If you choose a data store that doesn't have enough space, it's going to tell you insufficient space. And you can also individually select the network that you want to connect to. You'll go ahead and click on Next, and you'll run that same pre-recovery check, and this is going to verify that your data store exists, that you have enough space, etc. before the restore. So it's kind of a way of checking to make sure everything should go okay. Another feature that has been added to NetBackup is the instant recovery of virtual machines. As our environments grow and our reliance on IT systems grow, we need to be able to recover virtual machines faster. One of the new features is the instant recovery of VM backups through NetBackup. So nobody wants to wait while that virtual machine gets restored. So NetBackup 7.6 includes the IRV feature, which is the instant recovery of VMs. Right now, this is a command line option. You'll have to use this command here, the nb restore IVM command line, with a couple of switches to allow you to do that instant recovery of a virtual machine. Basically what it's doing is it is adding the virtual machine and attaching it to the backup image, allowing the virtual machine to come online while it is migrated from the backup image to the data store. That virtual machine can be back online and serving out data in a limited capacity, and by that I mean there is going to be a bit of slowness while that virtual machine is migrated back from the backup image to the data store. You will see a little bit of a performance drop in that. It's negligible, but your data is available for you almost instantly. And that's all covered here and how this works, and this presentation will be made available to dig into it a little further. vSphere integration. One of the additional features we have now is the ability to look within VMware vSphere and look at what's going on with NetBackup. So Symantec has introduced their vCenter plugin. This is a virtual machine that runs within your VMware environment and interacts with vSphere much more tightly. You can actually restore VMs, check the status of your virtual machine backups, and include or exclude virtual machines from backup. So now your VMware administrators can actually exclude a virtual machine from being backed up if they're working on that virtual machine. They also have the option to restore virtual machines. They will need to make sure that whoever is doing this is restricted by permissions, so you wouldn't have a normal user. Maybe you have administrators that aren't really administrators. They have read-only access to VMware. They will not be able to do these restores. So once that virtual machine is deployed, it will track all of the backups of VMs, allowing for that restore through a nice simple wizard, right-clicking on a virtual machine and choosing the restore option. It also allows you to monitor with some very basic reports what backups have occurred. If there are any issues, those will show up. So it's a nice tight integration with VMware. So let's move on to troubleshooting a little bit. There's always going to be issues with backing up virtual machines due to the different configurations that are out there. Some VMware environments are very small. They only have a couple of virtual machines, different OSs, different resource allocations. So there's no way to guarantee that this is going to work first shot for every single person. So there's always going to be some troubleshooting. Some of the logs that you want to look at, you're going to want to look at on the backup host, tar, which is used for restoring. So if you're running into restore issues, that tar log is going to be a resource that you want to look at. For backups, you're going to want to look at BPVCAR and BPFIS. BPFIS will also apply to restores, since we are going to create the virtual machine, then snap it and restore the data. Another good set of logs to grab will be your VMware logs, and this is going to be the vSphere itself. Since we're relying on VMware and using that VMware API, those logs are going to contain a lot of critical data that's going to allow us to troubleshoot it much better. So you can collect an entire VMware support bundle for review. The other set of logs that can give you a lot of information is the individual VM logs and individual ESX host logs. The individual VM logs are located in the same location as your VM. In that data store, you'll see there'll be logs for that VM. And if you're having problems with an individual VM, those logs are going to provide you more information specific to the issue you're running into. And there's some troubleshooting tech notes that Symantec has published, and I'm including those in the presentation as well, and you can feel free to browse those. Those provide a lot of additional details and common issues you may run into. A couple of quick common issues that when they show up may not be so obvious as to what's going on. A status 1001 can occur. This only happens for VMware Intelligent Policies, and this happens when two machines have the same name and resolve to that same name. You cannot add a virtual machine to your selection list when it already exists, so you'll generate a 1001 error, and this will show up in your test query if you run it, or if that virtual machine is added and your policy has already been created, when the policy goes to run, you'll see that error show up. And here's a common example of how that can happen included in here. And some additional tech notes on that 1001 error are also included. Status 156 is probably the biggest, most common error you're going to find, and this indicates that there was a snapshot failure. You'll want to look at that BPFIS log on the backup host. That's going to tell you what's happening there. One of the biggest things is to verify, can the VM be snapped within VMware? A lot of times when you see that 156 error message, you'll go into VMware and try to snap the virtual machine, and there'll be a problem there, whether it's an I/O issue, a VM that has some damage, or possibly even vCenter having some issues itself. If you're backing up at the application level, such as Exchange, SQL, or SharePoint, you'll want to verify that your VSS Provider utility is installed on the VM itself, and that includes the NetBackup client. The restore VM will not boot. We covered this a little bit earlier, and this is what can happen sometimes with SAN-based restores. So one of the quickest ways to fix that is to try and use the MBD transport method. That typically solves the issue. And there is a tech note that talks about correcting the root cause of that, which is a SAN offline or read-only LAN issue. This tech article will cover the correction that needs to happen with the VMware and SAN side of the house. Another common issue that will come up is a restore failing. So if your vCenter is having issues with a specific VM, there is a possibility there's an option, or there's a problem with the vCenter database itself that's used to track the virtual machine. And when you attempt to restore it, there may be a hung record or transaction in the database that vCenter uses for the VM. So it may be necessary to leverage that restore ESXi server. And what you're doing is you're bypassing vCenter to put the host back to the individual machine and then bring it into vCenter. So this is a workaround for possible vCenter issues to get that virtual machine back online so that you can focus on why were we having this issue. Maybe you're working with vCenter, or if vCenter itself has failed, you do have the option of restoring the virtual machine directly to an ESX host so that it can begin to serve data while you're working on your vCenter server. Another issue you'll run into is a VMware policy change. And this can happen when you have multiple vCenter servers that you're backing up virtual machines from, where a specific media server may not have access to all the vCenter servers. If you're leveraging a DMZ, or you have remote sites where only media servers have access to one virtual center, there's a tech article that will walk you through a registry change, which will basically tie a media server to a specific vCenter, or tell it to exclude talking to other vCenter servers so that you don't have this timeout. Another issue is Accelerator option is grayed out during a policy configuration, and you'll need to make sure that you have the data protection optimization option license installed. And this is typically the only reason you'll see that. Another issue you may run into, VMs or vCenter not showing in the GUI, or query variables like annotations used. The advanced query allows you to query by VMware notes, annotations associated with a VM. It gives you a large number of options to refine the query to a very custom list of virtual machines to be backed up. Sometimes the VMware cache needs to be refreshed. By default, this happens every 8 hours. In a VMware environment where there are a lot of changes happening, you may need to reduce this to make sure that that cache is refreshed maybe every 4 hours or every 2 hours, and that depends on the amount of activity that happens. So these files are stored by default on a Linux server under NetBackup installation online_util fi_cntl on Linux, Solaris, and Unix. For Windows servers, that's program files. If you've used the default location, Veritas, NetBackup, and the path remains the same. And if you do not have a backup running, but you are experiencing this issue and you want to quickly force a refresh, you can move those XML files out of this folder and they'll be recreated the next time VMware is accessed. VM restore fails with a 2817 or 2820 error. This can commonly be caused by vCenter not being able to create the virtual machine. And one of the things to look at will be permissions. And there is a tech article included in here that discusses the exact permissions needed for a virtual machine to be able to be restored. Virtual machines may back up successfully, but that ability to create a virtual machine permission, if it's missing on that VMware account, you'll experience a restore failure. In our wizard, we looked at the option to remove backing information. If a virtual machine has been configured to use a CD-ROM drive that's attached to an ISO image in a particular data store, if that ISO image is no longer present, when you go to restore that virtual machine, it can't add that device in there connected to the ISO, and so your restore will fail. It's the same as trying to create a virtual machine in one shot to attach to the ISO. This can also happen if the data store you're putting it back to is no longer present, if you're restoring to original location. And essentially this error message is indicating that a VM configuration option is no longer valid. So perhaps the virtual machine is not able to attach to a physical CD-ROM drive, that physical drive being detached if it was USB or something along those lines. The quickest way to test and eliminate this is to remove backing information checkbox during your restore. This prevents those types of issues from popping up. And the other option is to not restore the UUID information or hardware version. The UUID information is that unique identifier that's associated with each virtual machine. If you try to put back a virtual machine with that UUID and it already exists and you haven't chosen the option to overwrite, you'll experience this type of error message here. And the hardware version can also be an issue if your vCenter has been upgraded, but your hardware version on the virtual machine has not, and VMware does not allow you to create a virtual machine with an older hardware version that it does not support. The Symantec VSS providers are included in your NetBackup download, and the tech article here will talk about exactly how to locate those and install them in your virtual machine. It's just a standard package. It's a very quick installation. By default, those will be where NetBackup is installed, Veritas, NetBackup, bin, goodies is where you'll find the shortcut that you'll run to install those. And at this point, we'll go ahead and open this up to questions that may come up if anyone has questions. We have several engineers who can answer those questions through your IM. If there are any questions, though, that maybe someone would like elaboration on, please go ahead and let me know. Are there any questions out there that we need to answer?
There's a few unanswered questions. I wasn't sure if Hep or Brad had a chance to look at those.
Okay. Well, let me go ahead and take a look at those and see what we have out here and see if we can help out. One of the questions that I see out here, let's see, this one has been answered. Okay. Okay, have you seen problems using Accelerator with duplications? I have not seen any issues come up with this. There may be specific options that if the duplication is happening with high I/O, we could run into problems there. That's something I haven't seen. So I haven't seen that issue coming up. One of the questions I see out here as well, does accelerated full backup take less space than traditional backup on the backup device? Since you're going to be backing up to an MSDP or data domain, you're going to use less space for an accelerated backup because what you're doing is you're only moving those blocks that have changed to the storage. And what happens is you're only moving those changed blocks, so it's not deduplication. That's one thing I do want to point out. It's not deduplication that is saving you the space. It is the accelerator feature only moving those changed blocks to storage. And then what it's going to do is NetBackup catalog information is going to build a list of blocks that make up the backup. So you'll move the physical blocks of data, the changed blocks, to storage and tie them to the backup, but you'll also include in that catalog entry the blocks that were not changed but are part of the backup that are already stored out there. So the catalog information is going to be the same size, but it's going to include blocks that were changed and blocks that were not changed. And this is separate from deduplication, but deduplication does play a role in that data reduction. So the short answer is that it does take up less space on your storage, but it's doing it not through deduplication, but through change block and only moving those change blocks. Okay. Let's see. We have a question here. What is the preferred way to exclude one-off VMs from VIP? There are a large number of parameters that you can use. I've seen customers who leverage at the notes field and they'll put in something like no backup or exclude, and they'll add an option into their advanced query that will exclude the specific note. That's probably the quickest and most effective way to do it, and this would be something that you would go in to VMware and add that no backup note, so it's not going to get added by default and there's a specific intent there to exclude that VM. That would be what I would recommend, and I think most support personnel would probably agree that that is the most effective way so that you don't accidentally exclude VMs that you really do want to back up. So I would leverage the notes field. Okay, let's see what else we have here. One question I see here as well, can you run Microsoft Shadow Copy and NetBackup at the same time? By that question, I think what was being asked is, can you use the Shadow Copy and the Symantec VSS providers at the same time? The Symantec VSS providers are intended to work with the existing Shadow Copy VSS writers, and so you actually are leveraging both of them, and they do work together. That is the intent of them, is that It's a few additional VSS writers, but it also leverages the existing Microsoft VSS writers. So they do work together, yes.
Hey, Chette, with the interest of time, you want me to collect the rest of these questions and then I'll just send it to you, and then perhaps we can do some sort of an email?
Yeah, absolutely. So the additional questions that are out there, if your question was not answered yet, it will be answered, and we'll get that information over to you to review, and we will address all the questions. So yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'll just close off this presentation. Thank you for attending today's Tech Tuesday. This webcast is offered every third Tuesday of the month. Our next session is scheduled for Tuesday, February 17th at 1 o'clock Central Time. Please look out for the email invite. An on-demand version of this webcast will be available within 2 to 3 days of the webcast and will be located on our company's website under Resource and Library. There will be a link in the email, too, that can take you directly to the recording. You can access any other previous Tech Tuesday on our website. If you have any topic ideas or suggestions for future Tech Tuesday, please send them to techtuesday@datalink.com. Thank you again for participating in today's webcast.